I never thought I'd be the guy writing about my marriage falling apart on the internet. But here we are. Let me set the stage. I've been married to my wife, Natalie, for 6 years. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect couple. I'm 35, an engineer, and she's 33, a financial analyst. We live in a nice house in the suburbs. No kids yet, but it was always in the plan. Natalie's family has always been a bit different. Her dad, Henry, is charming in a way that always seemed over the top to me, like a used car salesman who never turns off the act. Her mom passed away when Natalie was in her early 20s, and since then, her dad has been her rock, as she put it. They were unusually close, but I chalked it up to her losing her mom so young. Looking back, there were signs, little things that didn't sit right, like how Henry would call her late at night, even when it wasn't an emergency, or how he'd show up unannounced with excuses that felt weak. I remember joking once about how he acted more like an overprotective boyfriend than her dad, and Natalie snapped at me. "Nobody understands how much he's done for me," she said. I dropped it because I didn't want to fight over something that seemed insignificant. But over the last few months, things started to change. Natalie was on edge more often, snapping at me over the smallest things. She became obsessed with keeping her phone close, like it was glued to her hand. If I even glanced at it, she'd tilt the screen away or lock it. She started spending more weekends at her dad's house, claiming he needed help organizing his finances or fixing things around the house. At first, I didn't question it. I trusted her. But as time went on, it started to feel wrong. I caught her once, sitting in the living room, staring at her phone with this look on her face. Guilt and fear mixed with something else I couldn't place. She noticed me watching and immediately put on her everything's fine smile, but I knew something was off. I wish I'd trusted my gut then. It would have saved me from the nightmare that was about to unfold. It all started to spiral about a month ago. Natalie told me she needed to stay over at her dad's house for the weekend. "He's been feeling lonely," she said, "and I just want to make sure he's okay." At first, I didn't think much of it. Like I said, they've always been close. But something in her tone felt rehearsed, too perfectly casual. I asked if she wanted me to come along. Maybe we could all grab dinner together. Her reaction was immediate. "No, that's not necessary," she said a little too quickly. "It's just, you know how he is. He'd feel weird about it. He needs one-on-one time sometimes." Her words sounded reasonable enough, but her body language betrayed her. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sweater. Felt like she was daring me to question her, so I didn't. That night, I tried to distract myself. I watched a game, ordered takeout, but the whole time, my mind kept circling back to her. Around midnight, I texted her to say goodnight. She didn't reply. Not right away anyway. It took her almost an hour, and when she did respond, her message felt off. "Sorry, just got your text. Dad and I were watching a movie and didn't notice the time. Love you. Night." It wasn't unusual for her to watch movies with him, but the delay stuck in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was being paranoid. But the doubt wouldn't leave me alone. The next day, she came home, acting like everything was perfectly normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my night, and went on about how she and her dad spent hours reminiscing about her childhood. But something wasn't right. She was trying too hard. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her laugh felt forced, like she was overcompensating for something. I didn't press her about it, but that night, while she was in the shower, I did something I'd never done before in our entire relationship. I looked through her phone. She had her notifications muted, but her text messages with her dad weren't locked. I scrolled through the most recent ones, expecting to find nothing but mundane conversations about groceries or errands. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. "Last night was special. Can't stop thinking about it," he texted her. Her reply, "Me too. I always feel safe with you." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was I misinterpreting? Was there some other explanation? I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed to know more. And part of me was still desperate to believe it was nothing, that there was an innocent explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew I just opened a door I couldn't close. After finding those texts, I couldn't stop myself. It was like a switch had flipped in my brain, and every small detail I'd ignored before suddenly seemed significant. The way Natalie clutched her phone like a lifeline, how she always had some excuse to leave the room when her dad called, and those weekends she spent at his house. It all felt connected now. I started paying closer attention. The next weekend, Natalie said she was going to visit her dad again. This time, she told me it was because he was feeling down about the anniversary of her mom's death. It was believable, hell, I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't let it go. While she was packing an overnight bag, I casually asked, "What time should I expect you back tomorrow?" She didn't look up as she zipped her bag. "Oh, probably late afternoon. Maybe evening. Depends on how Dad's feeling." Her answer was vague enough to set me on edge. I didn't argue, though. Instead, I told her to drive safe and kissed her goodbye like everything was fine. As soon as she left, I started planning. I knew her dad's address. It wasn't far, maybe a 30-minute drive. I waited a few hours to make sure she'd arrived, then decided to take a drive myself. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for, but I figured seeing it with my own eyes might give me some clarity. When I got to Henry's house, I parked a couple of blocks away and walked. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone minds their own business. His house looked unassuming, just a single-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn. I crept up the sidewalk, my heart pounding like a drum. When I reached the side of the house, I noticed a window with the curtains partially drawn. The lights inside were dim, but I could see shadows moving. Then I heard them. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Muffled laughter and voices. Too close, too intimate. I leaned closer, trying to make out the words, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "You know I'll always choose you," Natalie's voice said softly. A deep, familiar voice. Henry's replied. "And you'll always be my girl." I felt sick, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I didn't want to believe it, couldn't. But their voices, their tone, the way she said those words, it was all too much. I stumbled back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I couldn't think straight. My mind was a whirlwind of denial, anger, and pure disbelief. On the drive home, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was just something innocent that sounded bad out of context. But deep down, I knew better. When Natalie came home the next day, I was ready to confront her. Or at least I thought I was. But when she walked through the door, smiling and acting like everything was normal, I froze. I didn't say anything that night. Couldn't. Instead, I told myself I needed more proof. Something undeniable. And that's when I decided to install a hidden camera. The decision to install a camera didn't come easy. I felt sick to my stomach even thinking about spying on my own wife. But I couldn't shake the memory of those texts, the voices I'd overheard, and the pit of dread that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. The next day, while Natalie was at work, I went out and bought a small, discreet camera that could be hidden in plain sight. I placed it in the living room, tucked inside a decorative vase on the bookshelf. It had a wide-angle lens and would record directly to my phone. I felt like a monster setting it up, but the alternative was worse. I needed the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. That weekend, Natalie made her usual trip to her dad's house. Before she left, I kept things light, pretending I wasn't drowning in suspicion. I kissed her goodbye, told her to have a good time, and watched her drive away. With her gone, I had free reign of the house. I decided to check her laptop, something I'd never thought to do before. It was password protected, but I guessed the combination on the third try, our wedding anniversary. The irony didn't escape me. Her email inbox was mostly mundane, work stuff, spam, a few emails from friends. But then I saw a folder labeled personal buried in her files. My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting to find nothing, half expecting to find everything. Inside were photos. Not just any photos, though, photos of her and Henry. At first, they seemed innocent enough, taken at family gatherings or dinners. But then I found one that made my stomach drop. It was a selfie of the two of them on his couch, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked too comfortable, her face glowing in a way I couldn't explain. I kept scrolling, finding more pictures that blurred the lines between familial affection and something darker. One photo showed her sitting on his lap, her arms wrapped around his neck. Another was of him kissing her cheek, but it wasn't the kiss of a father. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. I didn't need any more proof, but I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I needed to see what was happening in real time. That night, I waited for the camera feed to give me answers. Around 9 p.m., the live stream finally showed some activity. Natalie and Henry were sitting on his couch, a bottle of wine on the table. They were laughing about something, but the way they leaned into each other, the way their hands occasionally touched, it made my skin crawl. Then it happened. Henry reached over and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. Natalie didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she smiled at him. A soft, intimate smile that I hadn't seen in months. My stomach churned as I watched her lean in, resting her head on his shoulder. His hand slid onto her thigh, and she didn't stop him. I couldn't watch anymore. I shut off the feed and sat there in the dark, trembling with anger and disbelief. This wasn't just emotional closeness. This was something far worse. And I knew that when she came home the next day, there'd be no more pretending. It was time for answers. Natalie walked through the door the next evening like nothing had happened, smiling as she set her purse down and kicked off her shoes. She had that same rehearsed ease, the air of someone who thought they'd pulled off a flawless performance. "Hey, babe," she said casually, leaning in to kiss me. I turned my head slightly, letting her kiss land on my cheek instead of my lips. She frowned, pulling back. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer right away. My heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through me like a live wire. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stay calm. But the images, the videos, they were all too fresh in my mind. "Where were you last night?" I asked, my voice low and steady. She blinked, caught off guard. "At my dad's, like I told you. What's this about?" I stood up and crossed the room, putting some space between us. "And what were you doing there, Natalie?" Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of defensiveness flashing across her face. "We had dinner. Watched a movie. Why are you interrogating me?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Because I know you're lying." She froze, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. "Excuse me?" I pulled out my phone, unlocking it and pulling up the video from the hidden camera. I hit play, letting the sound of her laughter and Henry's voice fill the room. Her face went pale as she realized what she was hearing. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This," I said, my voice hard, "is what I had to do to get the truth. I've been watching you, Natalie. I've seen the way you act around him. I've read the texts. I've seen the pictures. Don't you dare stand there and act innocent." Her face crumpled for a moment, but then she straightened, her jaw tightening. "You're spying on me now? That's disgusting, Matt. I can't believe you would invade my privacy like this." I laughed bitterly. "Privacy? Is that what you call sneaking around with your own father? Don't try to turn this on me, Natalie. I'm not the one breaking every boundary of decency." Her eyes welled up with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt, shame, or anger. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "Then tell me what it is," I shouted, my composure slipping. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was her muffled sobs. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice breaking. "Whatever this is, whatever sick game you're playing, it's over. I want you out of this house by the end of the week." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "Matt, please, it's not like that. You don't understand." "Then make me understand," I said coldly. "Because right now, all I see is a woman who betrayed her husband in the worst way possible." But instead of explaining, She just sat there, shaking her head. And in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't sorry. Not really. She was only sorry she'd been caught. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to her tears. I didn't need any more answers. I already had everything I needed to end this nightmare. The next few days were unbearable. Natalie avoided me as much as she could, but when we crossed paths, she'd look at me with these pleading eyes, like I was the one who owed her an explanation. I didn't bother engaging. My energy was focused on something else, digging deeper. I knew the affair was real, but I needed more. I wanted to expose her lies in a way that left no room for denial. So, while Natalie spent her time hiding in the bedroom, I spent mine piecing together the full story. First, I went back through her texts and emails. This time, I paid attention to every detail. Timestamps, locations, even emojis. The messages between her and Henry weren't just inappropriate. They were disgusting. There were hidden nuances in their conversations, veiled references to nights spent together, and even inside jokes that felt like daggers in my chest. One text stood out. It was from Henry. "You make everything worth it. I don't care what anyone says. We'll always have this." Her reply was even worse. "Forever, Daddy. No one will ever take this away from us." The bile rose in my throat. "Forever, Daddy?" My hands trembled as I took screenshots, documenting every word. But the messages weren't the worst of it. As I dug further, I uncovered receipts for hotel stays. 2 names listed on the invoices, hers and Henry's. Some of these trips were during weekends. She told me she was at work conferences. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was logistical, planned, and calculated. That evening, I decided to check her car. She was asleep, and I knew she wouldn't hear me slip outside. Her glove compartment was a mess of old receipts and paperwork, but one envelope caught my eye. Inside was a printed itinerary for a weekend getaway, complete with spa reservations and dinner plans, for 2. The date? Last month. I clenched the paper so hard it crumpled. Every piece of evidence added another crack to my already shattered heart. By the time I returned to the house, I felt like I was floating. Anger, disgust, and heartbreak blurred together into something unrecognizable. But I couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. The wedding vows, the anniversaries, the quiet nights we'd spent together. All of it was tainted now. The next morning, Natalie came downstairs, her face pale and her eyes puffy from crying. She sat on the armrest of the couch, hesitant. "Matt," she started softly. I didn't let her finish. "I know everything, Natalie. The texts, the hotel stays, the lies. You think I'm stupid." Her eyes widened in panic. "You've been going through my things?" "Damn right I have," I snapped. "You've left me no choice. I gave you a chance to explain, to tell me the truth, but you didn't. So, I found it myself." She swallowed hard, her gaze darting to the floor. "It's not what you think. Stop saying that," I shouted, standing up. "Stop pretending there's some magical explanation that makes any of this okay. Just admit it, Natalie. Admit what you've done." Her lip quivered as she finally looked at me. "It started after my mom died," she whispered. "I was so lost, Matt. I didn't know how to cope, and my dad. He was there for me in a way no one else was. It just happened." I stared at her in stunned silence, unable to process what I was hearing. "It just happened? Are you listening to yourself? Do you even hear how twisted that sounds?" Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. "I never meant to hurt you," she said weakly. "That's the only thing you didn't mean to do," I said coldly. "But you did it anyway, and now you're going to pay for it." She flinched, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Good. She deserved to feel every ounce of pain she'd inflicted on me. I walked past her without another word, slamming the door behind me as I left. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. I drove aimlessly for hours after storming out, my mind racing with ways to handle this. Confronting her had brought no satisfaction. Just more excuses, more lies. If anything, it made me angrier. She deserved consequences. Real consequences. When I finally pulled into a parking lot to collect my thoughts, a plan started forming. It was ruthless, but then again, so was what she'd done to me. I wasn't just going to leave her, I was going to destroy her. The first step was to expose everything. Natalie had painted herself as a perfect wife, an ambitious professional, and a loving daughter. Everyone in our circle thought she was flawless. That illusion was about to shatter. I made a list of all the evidence I had, screenshots of the texts, the video recordings from the hidden camera, the hotel receipts, the photos I'd pulled from her laptop. This wasn't just personal proof, it was ammunition. The next step was deciding where to start. Her friends? Her coworkers? No, too small. I needed this to hit harder. I needed to aim higher. Henry. I knew that exposing him alongside her would ensure maximum fallout. He was a respected figure in his community. A retired teacher, a deacon at his church, and a regular volunteer at local events. If people knew what he'd done, it would ruin him. The thought of their shared humiliation gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. I started gathering the materials. I compiled a folder with all the damning evidence and made multiple copies. I stored everything on encrypted drives and even emailed a backup to myself, just in case. Then I contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a shark. I wanted someone who would tear her apart in court. Someone who'd ensure she walked away with nothing. When I explained the situation, the lawyer was stunned at first but quickly assured me we could use the evidence to my advantage. "Do you want this handled discreetly or publicly?" she asked. "Publicly," I said without hesitation. "The bigger the spectacle, the better." She nodded, already scribbling notes. "I'll draft the divorce papers and include a restraining order if you want one. As for the affair, well, this will give us leverage. A judge won't look kindly on this kind of behavior." I thanked her and left the office feeling more in control than I had in weeks. The pieces were falling into place. But I wasn't done yet. The final step was the grand reveal. I wasn't just going to let them squirm in private. I wanted their humiliation to be public, undeniable, and absolute. I reached out to the local church where Henry was a deacon and set up a meeting with the pastor. My story was carefully crafted, just enough to pique his interest without spilling the full truth. I told him I had evidence of serious misconduct involving Henry and asked if he could arrange a meeting with the church board. The pastor agreed, visibly uncomfortable but intrigued. I set the date for the following week. As I drove home, I imagined the look on their faces when the truth came out. The shame, the panic. It would all be worth it. By the time I walked through the front door, Natalie was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up as I entered, her eyes puffy and red. "Matt," she started, her voice trembling. I didn't even glance at her. "Pack your things," I said coldly. "You've got until Friday." "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I don't care," I said, heading upstairs. "Just be gone. And trust me, you'll regret what you've done before this is over." Her quiet sobs followed me as I climbed the stairs, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. This wasn't just about ending our marriage anymore. It was about making sure she and Henry never forgot what they'd done. The day of the meeting with the church board came quickly. I'd spent the week preparing, rehearsing what I would say, and double-checking that all my evidence was organized. I knew this was going to be explosive, but that's exactly what I wanted. The pastor had arranged for a private meeting in one of the smaller rooms at the church. When I arrived, the members of the board were seated at a long table, and Henry was there too, looking confident and completely oblivious. "Matt," Henry said as I entered, his tone forced and cordial. "What's going on?" I ignored him and shook the pastor's hand. "Thank you for setting this up," I said. The pastor gestured for me to take a seat. "We're here to address a serious matter you've brought to my attention," he began. Henry's confident smile faltered. "What matter?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the neatly organized folder. Without a word, I placed it on the table and slid it toward the pastor. "This," I said. The pastor opened the folder, his face paling as he scanned the contents. The rest of the board leaned in, their expressions ranging from confusion to shock. "What is this?" one of them asked. "It's evidence," I said, my voice steady but cold. "Evidence that Henry has been engaging in an incestuous relationship with his own daughter, my wife, Natalie." The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Henry's face went white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "That's a disgusting lie," he finally spat, standing up so quickly his chair toppled over. I calmly pulled out my phone. "Would you like me to play the recordings?" "Matt, you don't need to do this," Henry said, his voice shaky now. "Oh, I think I do," I replied. Before he could protest further, I pressed play on the video from the hidden camera. The room was filled with the sound of his voice and Natalie's laughter, their intimate conversation undeniable. Gasps echoed around the table as the board members leaned closer, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. "This is fake," Henry shouted, his voice cracking. "It's doctored. He's trying to ruin me." I stood up, towering over him. "You did that to yourself," I said, my voice deadly calm. "And if you think this is bad, just wait. This evidence is already with my lawyer. I'm filing for divorce, and I'll make sure everyone, your neighbors, your friends, your community, knows exactly who you are." The pastor cleared his throat, his face ashen. "Henry, I think you should leave," he said quietly. Henry turned to the board, desperation in his eyes. "You can't believe this. I've served this church for years." But no one came to his defense. As Henry stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the pastor turned back to me. "Matt, I don't even know what to say." "There's nothing to say," I replied, gathering my things. "But I thought you deserved to know what kind of man you've been trusting." As I left the church, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over me. This was only the beginning. When I got home, Natalie was waiting for me. Her bags were packed, and she was sitting by the door. "I heard about what you did," she said, her voice hollow. "Good," I replied, walking past her. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. "No, Natalie," I said, turning to face her. "You and your father ruined everything. I just made sure everyone saw the truth." She stood there, trembling, tears streaming down her face. "I don't have anywhere to go," she choked out. "That's not my problem anymore," I said coldly. "And trust me, this is only the beginning of your downfall." With that, I walked upstairs, leaving her to figure out where to go. She didn't deserve my pity, and I had no intention of giving her any. The next morning, the fallout began to spread. Word travels fast in a small community, and the evidence I'd presented at the church meeting had already made its rounds. My phone buzzed constantly, calls, texts, emails, but I ignored them all. This wasn't my mess to clean up. Henry's picture was plastered across local social media pages, accompanied by whispers of the scandal. People who'd once praised him for his community work now openly expressed their disgust. One post stood out. "How could someone so respected turn out to be such a monster? My kids will never step foot in that church again." The messages of outrage piled up, and by the afternoon, Henry had resigned from his position at the church. Natalie, meanwhile, was silent. She hadn't come home the night before, and I didn't care to know where she'd gone. But I wasn't done yet. I had copies of the evidence prepared for Natalie's workplace. Her employer prided itself on its family values and strict moral code. I emailed the HR department with a concise message. Subject: urgent concern regarding employee conduct. Body: attached as evidence involving your employee, Natalie, and her father. I believe this behavior violates company policies and ethical standards. You'll find all the details in the attached file. Best regards, Matthew. I attached everything. The texts, the photos, the hotel receipts. It was brutal, but she'd left me no room for mercy. That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed an unknown number, but I answered out of curiosity. "Matt," came the voice on the other end. It was Natalie. "What do you want?" I said coldly. I need to explain," she said, her voice trembling. "There's nothing to explain, Natalie. You destroyed this marriage the moment you chose him. "I didn't choose him," she cried. "It wasn't like that. He manipulated me, Matt. After Mom died, he made me feel like I had no one else. I didn't know how to say no." Her words were a twisted attempt at sympathy, but I wasn't buying it. "You're an adult, Natalie. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them. You don't understand," she screamed, desperation laced in her tone. "You're ruining my life." "You ruined mine first," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "And this is only the beginning." I hung up before she could respond, blocking the number. The following day, I received an email from Natalie's workplace confirming they'd received my report. They assured me the matter would be investigated thoroughly and that appropriate action would be taken. It didn't take long for the results. By the end of the week, Natalie was fired for violating the company's code of conduct. The news spread quickly, adding to the growing wave of condemnation she and Henry were facing. She showed up at the house that night, her eyes red and swollen. "Why are you doing this to me?" she begged, standing on the porch as rain poured down. "I'm doing this because you deserve it," I said, stepping back into the house. "Now leave before I call the cops." I shut the door in her face, the sound of her sobs muffled by the downpour. With Natalie taken care of, I turned my attention back to Henry. I forwarded the evidence to several local newspapers, and within days, headlines began to pop up. "Beloved deacon accused of incestuous affair with daughter. Shock and betrayal in quiet suburb. The Henry scandal." The story spread like wildfire, and Henry's reputation was obliterated. People began protesting outside his house, demanding he leave the community. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a cold satisfaction settling in. As the pieces of their lives fell apart, I realized there was one more move I could make. I contacted the authorities. While the affair might not have been illegal in our state, there were still financial implications: misuse of funds during their hotel stays, potential fraud in how expenses were covered. I provided every detail to the investigators, ensuring they'd leave no stone unturned. By the end of the month, both Natalie and Henry were under investigation, their lives reduced to rubble. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Their downfall wasn't just my revenge. It was justice. It didn't take long for the authorities to act on the evidence I'd provided. The investigation into Henry and Natalie unearthed more than I could have imagined. It turned out that some of the hotel stays and extravagant expenses had been charged to a shared account Natalie's father used for his charitable activities. This revelation turned their private disgrace into a public scandal of fraud and embezzlement. The local news jumped on the story. Henry exposed. Community leader accused of misusing charitable funds in scandal. Reporters hounded their doorstep. Neighbors whispered behind their backs. And the once respected family name was now synonymous with betrayal and deceit. Natalie called me again after the news broke, but I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear her excuses or pleas. I had no sympathy left to give. Henry was formally charged with financial fraud and breach of trust. Though the incestuous relationship wasn't explicitly illegal in our state, the judge and prosecution made it clear they were disgusted by his behavior. During the hearings, Henry sat hunched over, no longer the proud man I'd once known. His fall from grace was complete. Natalie wasn't spared either. As her name was tied to the misuse of funds, her involvement became a legal gray area. While she wasn't formally charged, her professional life was over. No company would hire her now, not with the scandal attached to her name. I attended one of the court hearings out of sheer curiosity. Seeing Henry's defeated posture and Natalie's tear-streaked face didn't bring me joy, but it gave me closure. They'd destroyed my life, and now they were reaping what they'd sown. The divorce proceedings were straightforward. My lawyer presented the evidence of Natalie's affair, her lies, and her role in the scandal. The judge granted me a favorable settlement: full ownership of our house, most of our savings, and no spousal support for her. Natalie didn't even fight it. She seemed too broken to argue, signing the papers with trembling hands. When the final decree was issued, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The chapter was closed. Henry sold his house and disappeared from the community, likely moving far away to escape the shame. Natalie's once bright future was now reduced to surviving day by day. From what I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, she was living in a dingy apartment on the other side of town, barely scraping by. I, on the other hand, began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. I still had nights where the betrayal replayed in my mind, but the absence of their toxicity in my life made it easier to heal. One night, as I sat alone in the house that was now completely mine, I thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss. But I also thought about how far I'd come. They say revenge doesn't bring peace, but in my case, it gave me clarity. I learned that I was stronger than I ever believed, capable of standing up for myself and refusing to let betrayal define me. I also learned to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I still don't know if Natalie and Henry fully understand the extent of the damage they caused, but that's no longer my concern. They're out of my life for good, and for the first time in a long time, I feel free. The road ahead is mine to pave, and I'm determined to make it one worth walking. A week after the divorce was finalized, Natalie showed up at the house unannounced. She looked thinner, paler, a shadow of the woman I once knew. "Please, Matt, can we talk?" she begged, standing on the porch. "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly. Her eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake. I wasn't in my right mind. Please, just give me another chance." I stared at her, my emotions cold and distant. "You made your choices, Natalie. Now live with them." She tried to argue, but I stepped back inside and shut the door in her face. Her sobs faded as I walked away. Henry's situation grew worse. His trial had become a spectacle, and he'd become the town pariah. At one point, I heard he'd tried to reach out to Natalie, but even she wanted nothing to do with him now. I couldn't muster any sympathy. He'd built a life on lies, and now those lies had consumed him. With the house now fully mine, I began to make changes. I repainted rooms, replaced furniture, and removed every trace of Natalie from my life. Felt like reclaiming my space, my freedom. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends, and exploring hobbies I'd neglected during my marriage. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. People who knew about the scandal often asked if I regretted exposing it so publicly. My answer was always the same: no. They deserved everything they got. One day, I passed by Natalie in town. She was sitting alone on a bench, her face worn and tired. She didn't see me, and I didn't stop. As I walked away, I realized something. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just freedom. That was the moment I knew I was finally free.